Fair use disclaimer.
In this dialogue, I am going to be talking about article excerpts. 2 parts. Part 1, wedding vows. Part 2, wedding rituals and symbolism. Part 1, wedding vows.
History of wedding vows. From Zola.com.
According to this article entitled, History of Wedding Vows, this article states, during the 11th century, marriage evolved to be less about casual trade relationships and more about political advantage. This is when arranged marriages between both royals and commoners alike became a thing. During this time, in 1140 to be exact, the Benedictine monk, Gratian, created his canon law textbook, Decretum Gratiani. This required the consent and consummation of the couple to make a marriage official. Then in 1563, the Council of Trent deemed marriage to be one of the 7 sacraments. So where do marriage vows come into the history of weddings? It was just around the time when marriage was deemed an official sacrament of the Catholic Church that the well-known vows became a part of the marriage ritual. In fact, most couples who have traditional Christian wedding ceremonies recite some components of the famous vows first written in Thomas Cranmer's The Book of Common Prayer. While the first copy was written in 1549, a final revision was made by James I in 1662. That's the version still used by the Church of England today. While you might think there's no way anything said in a ceremony from the 1500s would still ring true today, you might be surprised. While the Book of Common Prayer was first introduced in 1549, the sentiments were from long before Cranmer's historical work. Much of the modern wedding ceremony as written by Cranmer actually came from various Catholic medieval rites, such as the Sarum ritual, a process followed for celebrating any kind of Christian public worship. The problem, however, is that the entire sermon, other than the actual vows, was in Latin. Cranmer made the ritual more accessible, changing the way we celebrate weddings today. What makes the 1549 service significant is that it is the introduction of a Protestant service in English, and it's basically the words that we all know, with a couple small tweaks. Reverend Duncan Dormer of St. John's College at the University of Cambridge said, "It was the vows from the Sarum Rite of medieval England, which were then utilized in the Book of Common Prayer, that became the traditional vows many Catholics and Christians, as well as non-denominational couples, still utter with very few changes." Here's a look at how similar modern vows are to those of the past. From the Book of Common Prayer by Thomas Cranmer. I take thee to be my wedded husband or wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and to obey, till death us depart, according to God's holy ordinance. The obey portion was only used by women, while the men just promised to cherish their wives. Other than that, and the final wording of being parted by death, the passage has remained very intact. While there are several variations, today's standard goes like this: to have and to hold from this day forward, For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. According to this article entitled History of Traditional Wedding Vows, written July 24, 2015, from thepineshouse.co.uk, it states, in English-speaking countries, the most popular vows are those spoken in Anglican churches. The Book of Common Prayer dates back to 1549, but it isn't the first place that these vows can be found. In fact, they date back to the Sarum rite, which was used in medieval England. The Sarum ritual was a set of procedures followed for celebrating any kind of Christian public worship, including masses, liturgies, and special occasions such as weddings. That was Part 1, Wedding Vows. And now on to Part 2, Wedding Rituals. I'm going to look at different articles. I won't read the entirety of these articles. They are sharing information on wedding traditions, the origins of the modern wedding culture that we have today. And so this particular article is entitled 16 Wedding Traditions and Their Origins. It was updated October 27th, 2023, and it's from personalcreations.com. And so I'll just pick different examples that I think are interesting to share.
Wedding veil.
This wedding tradition dates back to the origin of arranged marriages. Traditionally, the groom's family would not allow him to see his bride until the wedding. This is because if he didn't like her looks, there was a chance that he might not agree to marry her. Therefore, the veil was used to conceal the bride's appearance up until the very moment in which they were to be married.
Wedding cake.
Since cakes represent fertility, ancient Romans would bake wheat cakes and break them over the bride's head. Soon it became customary to stack these wheat cakes one on top of another, as tall as they could go. The bride and groom were challenged to kiss over the tower without knocking it over. If successful, they'd enjoy a lifetime of good fortune as a couple.
Bridesmaids.
In ancient Rome, the purpose of having bridesmaids at a wedding was to protect the bride. The bridesmaids would each wear the same dress as the bride in order to confuse the evil spirits and prevent them from finding her. As a result, the couple would avoid being cursed on their wedding day. Now I'm going to minted.com, and this article entitled 13 Popular Wedding Traditions and Their Origins.
Carrying a bridal bouquet.
These days, brides are carrying peonies and roses down the aisle. But back in ancient Greece and Rome, it was all about herbs. During that time, it was en vogue to hold aromatic bouquets of garlic, dill, and other herbs and spices to ward off evil spirits. Thankfully, we've graduated from pungent herb bouquets to lush floral ones, often comprised of the bride's favorite bloom. Carrying a favorite flower variety is a tradition that became popular in 1840 when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert and carried a bouquet of snowdrops, his favorite flower.
Wedding veil.
The tradition of wearing a wedding veil also dates back to ancient Rome, where a bride would walk down the aisle, also wearing a veil over her face to disguise herself from any evil spirits looking to ruin her wedding day. Apparently, spirits were quite the concern back then,
Wedding cake.
The tradition of a wedding cake also comes from ancient Rome, where guests broke a loaf of bread over the bride's head to symbolize fertility. The newlyweds would share a few bites, while guests would scoop up the leftover crumbs for good luck. In medieval England, the bride and groom had to try to kiss over a pile of stacked spice buns, scones, and cookies, a precursor to the tiered wedding cakes of today, supposedly ensuring a prosperous future if they were able to successfully smooch without toppling the whole thing over. This article, entitled 10 Wedding Traditions with Dark and Twisted Origins by Business Insider. Romans used engagement rings to indicate ownership. According to the American Gem Society, anthropologists believe that engagement rings date back to a Roman custom in which wives wore rings with keys attached, which indicated that their husbands owned them. Engagement rings began to get a little less dark in 1477 when Archduke Maximilian of Austria commissioned an extravagant diamond ring for his new wife. The accessory grew in popularity in the Victorian era, and gradually the diamond ring trend trickled down from nobility to the masses.
Bridesmaids originally dressed alike to confuse vengeful spirits from harming the bride.
There is a theory that the tradition of bridesmaids dressing alike dates back to ancient Rome, the bride considered to be prime bait for vengeful spirits. So all the women dressed alike to confuse the spirits from interrupting the bride and groom's nuptials. Another theory, however, dates back to the Victorian era. Dr. Liz Gloyn, a lecturer in Classic and Royal Holloway at the University of London, told The Independent that the tradition stemmed from fear of competition. It is my belief that by regulating the bridesmaids formally into exactly the same garments, there was no room for any of them to try and outdo each other, let alone the bride. Through the use of grander fabric, grander jewelry, Dr. Gloyn said.
Centuries ago, a groom had to kidnap the bride if her family disapproved of their union. The best man was put in place to defend the groom in case the family retaliated.
The best man originated as the groom's choice protector. Many centuries ago, it was common for a groom to steal a bride from her family if they didn't approve of the union, and it was the best man's job to fight the family if they retaliated. It was also common practice for the best man to stand next to the groom with a sword in tow on the day of the wedding. In fact, ancient groups like the Huns, Goths, and Visigoths would store weapons in the floor of the church in the event of a brawl.
Carrying the bride across the threshold was symbolic of the bride unwillingly leaving her family.
The practice of the groom carrying the bride across the threshold of their new home or bedroom dates back to ancient Rome. At the time, the bride had to prove that she didn't willingly leave her father's home, as doing so would have been improper. Romans also believed evil spirits attempted to curse the couple one last time at the threshold, so the groom had to lift the bride's feet above the ground so as not to let the spirits enter her body.
Veils used to be red so that the bride looked like she was on fire, which would scare maleficent spirits away.
Back in Roman times, the bridal veil was actually a red sheet called a flammeum, which was designed to look like fire. The bride's entire body would be covered in it, in an attempt to scare off any evil spirits. Over time, the red went away, but veils remained a tactic used to shield the bride from maleficent forces. They were also used to weigh the bride down and prevent them from running away. This article from Reader's Digest entitled The Fascinating History Behind 15 Wedding Traditions. This was updated May 15th, 2024.
Wearing wedding rings.
You can thank the Egyptians for starting the wedding tradition of giving a beloved a ring. The circle of the ring represents eternity, as it has no beginning or end, and the empty space in the center symbolizes a gateway into the unknown. When Alexander the Great conquered the Egyptians, the Greeks adopted this tradition, making their own love rings inscribed with arrows and Cupid. The Romans carried on the ring tradition and established gold as the appropriate metal, often adding intricate carvings or gemstones. From there, wedding rings broadened to include a variety of metals and stones, and the worth depended on the wealth and status of the couple. For a long time, it was just women who wore the ring. It didn't become common for men to wear a formal wedding ring until around World War I.
Proposing with a diamond engagement ring.
Though the history of wedding rings stretches back to ancient times, the history of engagement rings is somewhat shorter. The practice of having two separate rings, one for the betrothal and the other for the wedding, began in the 12th century. The Catholic Church decreed that a wedding should be a holy ceremony, and that a ring for the woman should be part of it. At that point, people started giving one ring as a promise, and saving the real ring for the ceremony. Now, modern etiquette rules suggest a man should have a ring in his possession if he's proposing.
Wearing a wedding ring on the fourth finger.
Most married folks today wear their wedding ring on the fourth finger of their left hand, called the ring finger. You can credit this to the ancient Egyptians. They believed the vena amoris, or vein of love, ran through the ring finger directly to the heart. That isn't anatomically accurate, but it does give beautiful meaning to wearing your ring on that finger. The Romans adopted this tradition, along with the giving of rings, to show love and commitment.
Holding wedding ceremonies.
Getting married used to be a much looser affair. In most cultures, it simply required the consent of both parties, usually in the presence of witnesses. In the Middle Ages, English couples showed their consent by accepting an object given to them by their beloved. This object was called a wed, and was often a ring. The ceremony of joining two people in marriage then got the name wedding, a word we still use today. The Catholic Church signed the sacrament of marriage into religious law in the 16th century, and to this day, many people opt to get married in a church, Catholic or otherwise. So that is all I have regarding marriage/wedding vows and marriage/wedding rituals. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more.